All right, let's bring in Ella Kokotsis from the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs. She attended the event in Quebec City. Ella, have you got me now? Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, Peter. Thank you. How are you?
I'm great, and I'm really excited and glad that we were able to get you on the show today, because I think my biggest question going into all of this is what is this meeting for? What is it about? Is it to address the grievances and the things that the leaders are upset about with the United States, or is it to just air these grievances and kind of have a session where they can tell the U.S. president what they think about his trade policies?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think we're going to see definitely an airing of grievances. The Prime Minister is going to be going into a bilateral session with President Trump in about an hour from now. We'll have an indication after that meeting about how those discussions went. Certainly based on the tweets that we heard last night from President Trump, they set the tone for discussions that were going to be very difficult, not only between Trump and the Prime Minister, but between Trump and the rest of his G7 partners. So I think the tone is definitely very different from what we've seen in previous G7 summits going into this particular set of discussions. But I don't think all will necessarily be lost. I think there's probably not going to be a consensus-driven document, as we've seen in the past, around a number of difficult trade issues and perhaps climate change. But I think there's probably going to be some strong language on chemical weapons use in Syria and also North Korea. So I don't think the whole thing is for naught at this point, as some are speculating and suggesting.
And it's funny to try to parse through what some are saying and what some are suggesting and try to really get into the meat of it, which is, again, why we're glad to have you on. I wonder, in terms of tactics, I mean, everybody knows Donald Trump does not like these multilateral forums. This is not his forte by any means. Is there an approach that, I mean, if Justin Trudeau is going to sit down with him, is there an approach that he can take in a bilateral setting within that broader multilateral meeting where he can try to reestablish some common ground to get away from the angered rhetoric and more towards a place where we can try to find a way out of this?
I think that would be the goal. In reality, is that going to happen? I don't know, because what we've seen right now is that things are very unpredictable with Donald Trump. I mean, he landed here in Charlevoix, and basically the first words that came out of his mouth were that he was going to do everything he can to protect U.S. trade, and he's also going to try to get his G7 partners to invite the Russians back to the table again. And, you know, these discussions sort of came out of nowhere and are sidelining what we think the rest of the focus of the agenda should be. So how the Prime Minister is able to bring him back into the discussion and get him to focus on what the Prime Minister sees as his core issues, those being trade negotiations, issues on climate change, and gender integration into the communique. I mean, it's going to be a huge challenge at this point, because the thing that we do know is that Trump is completely unpredictable. So we're expecting the unexpected. At this point, we won't know until a final document or some kind of declaration or statement is issued.
Right. I remember reading something you wrote on that Russia should be allowed back into the G7 a while ago. The landscape has changed pretty dramatically since you wrote that paper. I wonder how you come down on this debate now, now that the landscape has changed so much. Do you think they should be allowed back in?
At this point, I think that decision is completely premature. Trump suggested, well, the Russians have always been part of the mix, and of course that's not true. The G7 has been meeting since 1975, so this is the 44th year that the summit has been meeting together, and it was only between it was a 16-year period between 98 and 2014 that the Russians were involved. So to say that the Russians have always been part of the mix is just not true. At this point, whether to bring them back into the mix, I don't think that decision is going to be made here. In fact, I think they're going to try to defer those talks, certainly engage the Russians. Engaging them in discussions on bilateral levels, on multilateral levels is key and important and integral to the partners, but bringing them back into this mix at this point, when they've clearly violated international rules and norms and law, as everybody has said, I don't think they're going to push back on that position right now. I don't think it's going to happen here, and I don't think it's going to happen at the G7 next year when we pass the baton to the French either.
And just really quickly before you go, you've watched the power and relationship dynamics change and ebb and flow over the years of the G8, the G7, the G20. How has Trump kind of galvanizing the other six against him, how has that changed that dynamic? Are you seeing that on the ground at this meeting?
Absolutely. I mean, the mood here is really unsettling. You see these acrimonious tweets going out just, on the heels of his arrival here in Charlevoix. It's not the kind of diplomacy that we're used to seeing at these summits. There's usually a very good mood of collaboration and commonality, and there's not always consensus on all the issues, but at the end of the day, we typically see a consensus document that expresses the shared views and opinions of the leaders. And that's probably not going to happen here. It will in certain sections. There's probably going to be something along the lines of perhaps a leader's statement rather than a joint communique or a joint declaration. And of course, this is a deviation from what we've seen in the past.
All right.
So a very different mood, a very different feeling from what we're used to seeing at these events.
Indeed, and it's fascinating to get your insight into all of this. Ella, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Appreciate it, thanks very much.
University of Toronto's Ella Kokotsis.